Leaders of the Group of Seven and their counterparts from partner nations gather for the first time since the start of the military confrontation between the US and Iran that now appears to have been suspended as the two countries agree to a framework towards peace. Welcome to Press Perspective for this Tuesday, June 16th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. This year's Group of Seven summit begins against the backdrop of news that the US and Iran have reached a tentative agreement to end their war. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks, great to be here.
I also have Chloe Borgnon with French broadcaster France 24 here in the studio with us. Chloe, it's great to have you here.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Right, Thomas, we start with you. What do we know about the memorandum of understanding between the US and Iran?
We just know kind of the broad outlines of it. We haven't seen, no one has seen the actual text of it, and it's not supposed to be very long. I've heard it's like a page and a half or so. But the broad strokes, it is that there will be a ceasefire extended for the next 60 days. Iran will reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. will lift its blockade of Iranian ports, and then Iran has, I guess, agreed to not seek any nuclear weapons in the future. And there's some sense that there will be U.S. or sanctions relief or releasing some frozen assets. And it's scheduled to be signed on Friday in Switzerland. The White House has actually said they've already digitally signed it. And beyond that, there's a lot other details that have come out basically in the media or some officials in the U.S. on speaking on news programs, or in the Iranian media are kind of very different though, and we're seeing a lot of distance. And both sides are definitely kind of spinning it as a big win, but I think there's still a lot to be seen. And, and again, a lot of it, I think, will just happen over this 60-day period. I mean, really, the fine details of it are only going to start being kind of worked out during this next period. But, from the U.S. side, they're kind of presenting it, and Trump has said this is like, the strait is just open again, practically already open, and is really hammering that Iran is not going to have nuclear weapons, and that anything with the releasing of the funds or the assets is very conditional on Iran meeting these goals or steps along the way. Whereas Iran is basically saying relief is already part of the deal. There's supposed to be this 24 billion in frozen assets, and Iran is saying 12 billion of that is coming up front, and then the rest will come phased along. There's also this talk about them receiving kind of reconstruction or reparations for the damage that's up to 300 billion, and that's floating around, maybe not paid by the U.S., but there's some talk that Gulf states will pay it. And they also seem to be insisting that they will have some role in the traffic through the Strait of Hormuz in the future. They're saying maybe not, it's not tolls necessarily, but could be fees, and I think they're kind of extending their sense of control over it. So obviously, as always, in a way, we'll wait to see what ends up coming out. I think the only thing you can guarantee at this point is that Trump will definitely say it was a great deal, biggest win ever, and so much better than the 2015, Obama brokered JCPOA deal. And, guaranteed he will declare it an incredible victory. But I think as for the rest, we'll have to see over the next 60 days.
Right, indeed. Chloe, as Thomas has just said, details of the preliminary peace pact have yet to be disclosed, but quite a number of analysts, they seem to agree that this particular agreement solves, and I'm quoting, solves everything except the hard parts. What exactly do these analysts mean?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of media have been doing the title about this. For example, if we take The Guardian, they say that Trump hails Iran deal that fixes nothing except problem that is war caused. So if we look, for example, at this article, that's one of the many articles of analyzing this deal and what it's really fixing. What they are saying, The Guardian, is that when Donald Trump is being so proud and announcing so blatantly the ship of the world, start your engines, let the oil flow, if we're quoting him. They're saying he's only fixing a problem that was created by the war in Iran, actually, so the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. But he's not fixing anything that was there before. And from what we know for the deal now, it seems like he's mostly been focusing on things that were created by the war, but not things that were there before. So if we remember, when the US decided to attack Iran, there were two main points, let's say, that Donald Trump wanted to fix. He was saying that one of the main points was to make sure that nuclear weapons could not be achieved by Iran. Actually, what we know is that discussion on nuclear deal will start again, but from the same point. In the deal from now, for now, what we know, they have not reached anything further, even though he has said that it was a red line for a lot of times. But for now, it's going to start again, so we just lost a few months. The other thing is also like the Iranian society. When Donald Trump started the war, he said he wanted to see a collapse and a change in the regime. Actually, the society is going towards more of a military society at the moment because the country was at war. So again, it's not something that has been achieved through the war. So it's just starting again, probably in an even worse condition than it was before. And I think it's interesting to see also, like The Guardian was also adding that actually the rest of the world has changed a lot in a way that can't be repaired probably. We have lost a lot of months with the shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. There's also obviously all the casualties, so the civilian especially who has suffered a lot in Iran, in Lebanon, in all the area around there, all the buildings also, that and infrastructures that have been destroyed. And so I think it was also interesting to see this point that those things will not be reversed and can't be made into a deal.
Right. And staying with such skepticism, Thomas, speaking with ABC News before the announcement of this preliminary agreement between the US and Iran, former US President Barack Obama, he shared a bit of skepticism, doubt about any agreement with Iran concerning their nuclear ambitions being significantly different or a significant improvement from the one that was reached during his time in office. Could you tell us a bit more about his thoughts?
Yeah, so, right, he was doing an interview on ABC News on Monday and said it was doubtful that any deal would be different or better than the JCPOA. It was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was, negotiated by his administration and, signed by not just the US and Iran, but several other countries as well. And, I think he's very much not alone in asserting that. I mean, I think there's been many, many questions as to how really this deal could be significantly an improvement over the past when it seems to more or less have the same outlines of, Iran agreeing. I mean, Iran at the time in 2015 also agreed that they would not pursue or try to obtain a nuclear weapon, and the administration this time around is kind of heralding that as the big victory of this entire endeavor, and then it just really is going to be a function of how do you monitor that? What sort of access is there going to be? And I mean, maybe there were some areas in the original JCPOA that you could say could be strengthened or improved, some access for the, monitors or something along those lines. But it's basically the same contours, and it's freeing up some frozen assets and, maybe loosening sanctions, et cetera. So it sounds, more or less the same. And, obviously what it's taken to get to that point, you can, certainly weigh that in the evaluation of it. But I think the other point that Obama made in that interview was he was just kind of reflecting on the idea. He said you can't, bomb or bully your way to solving these foreign policy issues, and kind of said that the U.S. seems to forget that history or need to be reminded of that. And he's speaking from a place of experience when I think when you're in that position, and obviously the power of the U.S. military to do a lot of things tactically or on the battlefield maybe does seem very enticing as a way to solve a problem. And I think this time around you could see you know, the U.S. and Israel did that bombing of the Iranian nuclear facilities last year, and that seemed to go incredibly smoothly, relatively. And then, you know, there was the operation in Venezuela removing, you know, President Maduro from power. And so I think there, you know, some have speculated there was this sense of, oh, wow, we can just, you know, do these things we want with very little cost to us. And so, you know, clearly there was some idea at the start of this campaign against Iran that this would be quick and easy. You know, after a few days, we would, you know, and there was an initial success of, you know, killing the leadership and you know, inflicting a lot of damage. But beyond that, suddenly you're in a position where, okay, this whole thing, Iran didn't just fall apart. They're counter-attacking, you know, and then obviously they have this incredible trump card, so to speak, to play of the Strait of Hormuz, which certainly, you know, a lot of people had advised would be the case. So, you know, and now you're in a situation where how do you get out of this? You can't just keep sort of bombing or, you know, finding a military solution to this problem. And, you know, U.S. has much recent history that has demonstrated that, you know, from Iraq to Afghanistan to going further back, Vietnam, you know, getting involved in these military operations that don't end up really leading to where you want things to go. So, you know, Obama was saying that, you know, ideally you want to exhaust diplomacy as much as possible, and maybe you get 80% of what you want or 90%, but it's preferable to, you know, just trying to think that you can solve these problems. And, you know, he clearly has a point that it does seem that, you know, generation by generation, the U.S. keeps trying, you know, or has had a tendency to try to solve problems through military means. So I think that was the other, you know, point that Obama was making, and I think, you know, it carries weight coming from somebody who was sitting in that position and had the power to do that kind of, you know, those operations.
Right. And speaking about Mr. Obama's term in office, Chloe, for the sake of perspective, very briefly, could you tell us a bit about the Obama-era nuclear deal with Iran, called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, of course?
Yeah, so the Iran nuclear deal was reached and signed in 2015 through a coalition, an international coalition led by the United States and Barack Obama at the time. Just Trump withdrew from it in 2018, and there has been no renegotiation through that. But what was the main point, as Thomas has said already on this agreement, was it was setting up limits on Iran nuclear program. So two things: it was halting the development in Iran of nuclear infrastructures, and it was also making sure that Iran was getting a cap on the enrichment of uranium. So they had the right to get 300 kilos of uranium enriched up to 3.67%. So that's only for the civilian commercial nuclear powers reactors. So that's the only one they could use was to make nuclear powered plants. And that was supposed to be their limit, actually, because the deal kind of went awry a little bit. According to some non-proliferation institutes, as of June 2025, Iran, there's this idea and this estimation that they might have a total of enriched uranium stockpile of nearly 10,000 kilos. And part of it, so 400 kilos of it, would be enriched up to 60%. So we're not to the point where you can make nuclear weapons, that's 90%, but they were still saying that the 60% is the nuclear explosive mark. So that's showing a bit of the limit. But the other big thing that was important in the Iran nuclear deal was the fact that they were imposing transparency rules. And one of the experts of non-proliferation was saying that actually this monitoring system was unique in the world, and that was critical for the success of any plans dealing with Iran nuclear program, was to make sure that there was transparency and there was a way to check and monitor what's going on in Iran.
Right, and this Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, I believe, took 18 months to hammer out. But the Trump administration is talking about 60 days to hammer out a deal with Iran now. Thomas, what has been Israel's response to this preliminary peace pact between the US and Iran, very briefly speaking?
I think, you know, it's very widely seen as a disaster or catastrophe for Israel. You know, Chloe mentioned earlier a couple of the starting points for Trump to start this war and some of his, you know, what his goals were initially. And, you know, I'm sorry. And in terms of Israel, they had two clear goals that were basically remove the existential threat to Israel, and destroy the nuclear ballistic missile programs, and create conditions for regime change there, and also to end Iran's support for proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, and cut their support for Hamas. And really, they're not in a position to realize either of those things. I mean, there basically has been three parties to this entire conflict, and Israel is not one of, it's only two parties that are making this peace agreement. So Israel is on the outside looking in. And, within Israel, I mean, criticism of Netanyahu in particular is really coming not just to the right of him, from the more hawkish side, but, even more centrist, or the public in general, I think also just sees this as disastrous. And, he's actually got an election coming up in October, and it's certainly going to become part of the, weapons, or rhetorical weapons against him as far as this goes. And, I think for Israel, I mean, a big part of this is that there has become this greater and greater distance between the U.S. and Israel as this has gone along. And, Israel clearly doesn't want things to end the way it is now, but Trump has very clearly signaled that he has wanted this to be over for a while. And there have been reports of dust-ups, angry conversations between Trump and Netanyahu. I mean, Trump has even talked about Netanyahu being difficult. And so, in a lot of ways, Israel is in a position now where the relationship with the U.S. is not, the same as it was in the past. And, when you look at where the conditions under which the U.S. is leaving now, it's hard to picture, Washington is really going to want to go back into the region again if Iran doesn't follow the letter of the law. And so we've even seen, though, part of the agreement as well, I should mention, was, U.S. was talking about, or what we know of this upcoming pact, this ceasefire extending to, Lebanon as well, and Israel. And Israel has said, we're not, really sticking with that. And even today, I was just hearing in the news reports of skirmishing again in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. And so, and Netanyahu has been kind of defiant about, we're not going to leave Lebanon. We're going to keep some forces there. And, so it's an incredibly, difficult position for Israel to be in from their own perspective, and certainly from Netanyahu's perspective. And I think, generally speaking, it's just widely seen as a real, I've seen it called a catastrophe or a disaster.
Right. And against this backdrop of this environment of geopolitical challenges, Chloe, quite a number of middle powers are speaking about the importance of coming together to better navigate the situation. That being said, over at the G7 in France, quite a number of middle powers, including South Korea, they've been invited, of course, as well as Kenya. And President Lee Jae-myung, he's set to sit down with his Kenyan counterpart, William Ruto, on the sidelines of the G7 summit this time around. The meeting comes amid news that South Korea has opened is opening aid and financing offices in Nairobi, the Kenyan capital. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, so this agreement has been made, in the beginning of this month, actually. There was a meeting of Minister of Foreign Affairs in Seoul, following up the Korea-Africa summit, actually, that happened a few years ago. And so along this meeting, two agreements were signed between South Korea and Kenya. The first one is the establishment of a permanent office in Kenya for the Korea Exim Bank, the Export-Import Bank. So the idea is to strengthen infrastructure financing from the Korea Exim Bank, investment facilitation, project development. So having a foot in the country will help bring some capitals from the South Korean investors into Kenya. And the second one is establishment of a permanent office in Nairobi of the Korea International Cooperation Agency, that is a South Korea official development agency. So they are already working with in some projects in Kenya, especially focused on education, climate, acclimatation, resilience, and public health. But what they've been saying is that by having this permanent office, they want to broaden the cooperation into technology transfer, infrastructure development, youth empowerment, public sector capacity building. So the whole idea is really to be able to develop the aid that's being brought to Kenya through South Korean organization. And it's interesting to see that during that moment, so at the beginning of June, in the bilateral talks between the foreign affairs ministers, they were also discussing the fact that there is a need and a will, at least, for deeper collaboration. So in technology, innovation, manufacturing, health, maritime affairs, defense. So, I mean, the sectors that the two countries can collaborate together are very important, very various. So I guess that's also going to be part of the discussion in the G7 summit.
Right, indeed, and perhaps we'll hear about the details of their talks once it takes place over in France. All right, Chloe, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you.
Thomas, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.